You say you want to be extraordinary. You scroll through social media, consuming stories of people who broke the mold, who refused to settle, who dared to be different. You nod along when someone talks about thinking outside the box or being authentic. You might even share a quote about courage or individuality. But then Monday morning arrives, and you find yourself nodding in that meeting when you disagree, staying quiet when the conversation turns towards something you know is wrong, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, wearing the invisible uniform of your profession, your social circle, your family's expectations. You want to be extraordinary, but you're terrified of being excluded. This is the great paradox of human nature. We despise mediocrity in theory, yet we choose it in practice. We dream of standing out, but we're hardwired to fit in. We say we value authenticity, but we punish it when it shows up in our presence, when it challenges our comfort, our assumptions, our carefully constructed social order. Here's what's really happening. You're living in what the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called herd morality, a system designed to keep you safe, comfortable, and utterly ordinary. It's a choice between the security of belonging and the terrifying freedom of becoming who you actually are. The question isn't whether you'll choose, you're choosing every day. The question is whether you'll choose consciously. Most people never do. They spend their entire lives as what Nietzsche called herd animals, following the crowd, seeking approval, avoiding the responsibility that comes with genuine independence of thought and action. It's easier, it's safer, but is it living? Friedrich Nietzsche understood something most of us spend our lives running from, that the very systems we think are protecting us are actually destroying us. Born in 1844 in a small German town, Nietzsche watched an entire civilization sleepwalk through existence. He saw people surrendering their individual will to the comfort of collective thinking. He witnessed the rise of what he called herd morality, a value system that prioritized safety, conformity, and mediocrity over the dangerous work of becoming an authentic human being. For Nietzsche, this wasn't just a philosophical problem, it was an existential emergency. He believed that most people live their entire lives as what he called the herd, a mass of individuals who have traded their capacity for independent thought and authentic action for the security of belonging to something larger than themselves. The herd doesn't think, it reacts. It doesn't create, it consumes, it doesn't lead, it follows. And here's the thing that made Nietzsche's analysis so cutting. He argued that herd morality isn't imposed on us by some external force. We choose it. We actively participate in our own domestication because the alternative, genuine individual responsibility, is terrifying. Think about it. When you conform, you're off the hook. If everyone else is doing it, you can't be wrong. If the group makes the decision, you don't have to bear the weight of the consequences. Conformity is a shelter from the burden of choice. But what are you sheltering yourself from, exactly? From the possibility of being wrong? From the risk of standing alone? From the responsibility of creating your own values instead of inheriting them? Nietzsche had a word for the person who chooses the opposite path: the Übermensch. Often mistranslated as Superman, it's better understood as the one who overcomes, the individual who has the courage to break free from herd morality and create their own meaning, their own values, their own path. The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe, he observed. To be a human being is a rare thing. Most people exist, that is all. The Übermensch isn't a fantasy figure with supernatural powers. It's a symbol of human potential, what we could become if we had the courage to stop seeking approval and start seeking truth. If we stopped asking, what will people think, and started asking, what do I actually believe? But here's where Nietzsche's insight gets uncomfortable. He didn't just criticize the herd for being weak. He criticized the systems that keep the herd weak. Religion, he argued, was often just herd morality dressed up in divine authority. Political systems that promised security in exchange for obedience, social structures that rewarded compliance and punished dissent. This wasn't nihilism. This was an invitation to step out of the comfortable prison of other people's expectations and into the terrifying freedom of self-creation. Nietzsche understood that herd morality operates through what he called slave morality. a system of values designed by and for those who lack the courage to take responsibility for their own lives. Slave morality makes virtues out of weakness. It celebrates meekness over strength, conformity over individuality, safety over truth. The person trapped in slave morality doesn't create values, they inherit them. They don't ask whether something is true, they ask whether it's acceptable. They don't pursue what they genuinely desire. They pursue what they think they're supposed to desire. And the tragedy? This system doesn't just limit your potential, it actively punishes you for having any. The moment you step outside the prescribed boundaries, the herd turns. They don't just disagree with you, they question your right to disagree. Have you experienced this? The subtle, or not so subtle, pressure to get back in line when you've dared to think differently. The way people stop inviting you to things when you stop pretending to agree with everything. The cold shoulder when you refuse to participate in the comfortable lies everyone else is telling. This is herd morality in action. And it works precisely because most people would rather be accepted than be authentic. The question Nietzsche poses to each of us is simple. Will you remain a member of the herd, or will you dare to become an individual? Most people choose the herd, and they spend the rest of their lives wondering why they feel so empty, so restless, so fundamentally disconnected from their own existence. But here's what Nietzsche knew. The path to authentic selfhood isn't just difficult, it's necessary, because the alternative isn't really living at all. So, why do we choose the herd when we know it's limiting us? Why do we surrender our authenticity for acceptance? The answer lies in understanding the psychological mechanisms that make conformity feel not just comfortable, but necessary for survival. Let's start with the most basic one, the fear of social exclusion. Your brain doesn't distinguish between physical and social threats. When you're rejected by a group, the same neural pathways fire as when you're in physical danger. This isn't metaphorical, it's literal. Social exclusion activates the anterior cingulate cortex and the right ventral prefrontal cortex, the same regions that light up when you touch a hot stove. This means that when you consider speaking up in that meeting, disagreeing with the consensus, or expressing an unpopular opinion, your brain is literally screaming danger at you. It's not being dramatic. It's trying to keep you alive using an ancient operating system designed for small tribal groups where exclusion meant death. But here's the cruel irony. The very mechanism designed to keep you alive is now killing your ability to actually live. Think about what happens when you're in a group and someone expresses a dissenting view. Watch the body language. Notice how people shift uncomfortably, how they exchange glances, how they subtly distance themselves from the dissenter. This isn't conscious cruelty. It's an automatic response. The group is unconsciously reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable thought. This creates what psychologists call system justification, our tendency to defend and rationalize the status quo, even when it's clearly not serving us. We don't just comply with the system, we convince ourselves the system is good. We tell ourselves that conforming is actually a virtue. It's being reasonable, practical, mature. But system justification goes deeper than that. It protects us from a terrifying truth, that we might be responsible for changing things. Consider how this plays out in your daily life. You stay in a job that drains you because that's just how work is. You maintain relationships that feel hollow because that's what adults do. You buy things you don't need to impress people you don't like because everyone does it. Each time you make these choices, you're not just conforming, you're actively participating in what Nietzsche called the will to conformity. You're choosing the comfort of mediocrity over the risk of authenticity. And the comfort is real. When you conform, you get something powerful, the illusion of certainty. You don't have to figure out what you believe because the group has already decided. You don't have to take responsibility for outcomes because you were just following orders, following tradition, following everyone else. This is what makes herd morality so seductive. It offers you an escape from the burden of individual choice. It promises that if you just follow the rules, stay in line, and don't ask too many questions, everything will work out fine. But there's another mechanism at play here, one that's even more insidious, the comfort found in shared mediocrity. When everyone around you is settling for less, your own settling feels normal. When everyone is complaining about their marriages instead of improving them, your complaints feel reasonable. When everyone is watching television instead of pursuing their dreams, your television watching feels justified. This creates what we might call mediocrity bubbles, environments where low standards become normal standards, where giving up becomes wisdom, where cynicism masquerades as realism. And here's the thing, these bubbles are comfortable. They require nothing of you except that you remain as small as everyone else. They ask only that you don't shine too brightly, don't want too much, don't expect too much from yourself or others. The person who breaks out of the mediocrity bubble becomes a threat not because they're better than everyone else, but because they're proof that everyone else could be better too. They're evidence that the excuses don't hold water, that the limitations are chosen, not imposed. This is why authentic individuals often find themselves lonely. They're not being rejected for their failures, they're being rejected for their success. They're being punished not for conforming too little, but for inspiring too much. There's also what we might call the social proof cascade, the phenomenon where one person's conformity makes it easier for the next person to conform, and so on, until entire societies are living lives they never consciously chose. You see this in fashion, in politics, in career choices, in relationship patterns. Someone starts a trend not because it's good, but because it's new. Others follow, not because they believe in it, but because others are following. Soon, what started as one person's arbitrary choice becomes the way things are done. The scary part? Most people in the cascade have no idea how it started or why they're participating. They just know that everyone else is doing it, so it must be right. This connects to another powerful mechanism, the diffusion of responsibility. When you're part of a group making a decision, you feel less responsible for the outcome than if you were deciding alone. This makes it easier to go along with choices you wouldn't make individually. You've experienced this. You've been in group situations where you watched something happen that you knew was wrong, but you didn't speak up because you weren't the only one who could have. Everyone was equally responsible, which meant no one felt responsible. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't make them disappear, but it does give you a choice. You can recognize when your brain is confusing social discomfort with mortal danger. You can notice when you're justifying systems that don't serve you. You can identify when you're choosing mediocrity because it feels safer than excellence. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? The psychology of conformity isn't just philosophical speculation. It's been measured, documented, and proven in some of the most revealing experiments in human history. What these studies show is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. We are far more susceptible to group pressure than we'd like to believe. In 1951, a young psychologist named Solomon Asch conducted what would become one of the most famous experiments in social psychology. The setup seems simple enough. Show people a line, then ask them to identify which of 3 comparison lines matched its length. The answer was obvious. So obvious that when people did the task alone, they got it right 99% of the time. But Asch wasn't interested in people's ability to judge line lengths. He was interested in their ability to resist social pressure. Here's what really happened in the experiment. Only one person in each group was actually a participant. The others were actors, instructed to give obviously wrong answers. The real participant, unaware of the setup, found themselves in a room where everyone else was confidently stating that a clearly shorter line was the same length as the target line. The results were staggering. When faced with a unanimous but incorrect majority, 75% of participants conformed at least once. On average, people gave wrong answers about 1/3 of the time, even when the correct answer was obvious. Think about that. These weren't complex moral questions or ambiguous situations. These were simple visual tasks where the right answer was clear, yet 3 out of 4 people were willing to deny the evidence of their own eyes rather than stand alone against the group. Asch himself was disturbed by his findings. In interviews afterward, many participants said they knew their answers were wrong, but went along anyway to avoid standing out. Others actually convinced themselves they were seeing incorrectly. The social pressure was so intense, it literally changed their perception of reality. But Asch's experiment was just the beginning. In 1963, Stanley Milgram took the investigation of conformity into even darker territory. Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people could participate in atrocities. His experiment involved 3 people: a teacher, the real participant, a learner, an actor, and an experimenter, another actor in a lab coat. The teacher was told to deliver electric shocks to the learner every time they gave a wrong answer to a memory test, increasing the voltage with each mistake. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. As the experiment progressed, they heard the learner screaming in pain, begging to stop, eventually falling silent. Many participants showed obvious distress, sweating, trembling, arguing with the experimenter. But when the authority figure calmly said, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you go on," most people did. 65% of participants delivered what they believed were potentially lethal shocks to a stranger, simply because someone in authority told them to. Milgram's conclusion was chilling. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. These weren't psychopaths or sadists. These were normal people, teachers, postal workers, engineers, who surrendered their moral judgment to the comfort of following orders. They chose obedience over conscience, authority over authenticity. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of both experiments was what happened when the social pressure was reduced. When Ash allowed just one other person to give the correct answer, conformity dropped dramatically. When Milgram moved the authority figure out of the room, obedience plummeted. This tells us something crucial. We're not fundamentally weak or evil. We're social creatures who evolved to coordinate with groups. But that same capacity for coordination can be weaponized against us. Consider how these dynamics played out in one of history's most famous cases of nonconformity, the trial of Socrates in 399 BC. Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods, but his real crime was simpler. He refused to stop asking uncomfortable questions. He challenged the conventional wisdom. He made people think about whether their beliefs were actually true or just inherited assumptions. The Athenian democracy, supposedly a system that valued free thought, condemned him to death for it. Why? Because Socrates represented everything the herd fears: the individual who refuses to blend in, who won't accept, because everyone believes it, as a valid reason for anything. Socrates could have escaped. He could have apologized, promised to be quiet, agreed to conform. Instead, he chose to drink the hemlock rather than surrender his intellectual independence. He understood something most people never grasp, that a life lived entirely on other people's terms isn't really a life at all. Nietzsche saw Christianity through a similar lens. He argued that Christian morality, as it had evolved, was essentially a form of herd control, a system that made virtues out of weakness and submission. Blessed are the meek wasn't spiritual wisdom. It was a recipe for keeping people docile. This wasn't an attack on genuine spirituality or moral concern for others. It was a critique of organized systems that used moral language to discourage independent thinking and authentic self-development. You can see these same patterns playing out today in corporate culture. Companies talk about innovation and thinking outside the box, but they systematically reward conformity and punish genuine dissent. They want creativity that stays within acceptable boundaries, innovation that doesn't challenge fundamental assumptions. The employee who points out that the emperor has no clothes doesn't get promoted. They get marginalized, labeled as not a team player, quietly pushed aside. Meanwhile, the people who excel at reading the room, saying what others want to hear, and avoiding uncomfortable truths rise through the ranks. What all of this evidence points to is a fundamental truth about human nature. We are capable of extraordinary conformity, even when it requires us to betray our own perceptions, our own values, and our own potential. But here's what the research also shows: we don't have to be. The mechanisms Ash and Milgram identified in their laboratories didn't disappear when the experiments ended. They simply moved online, into boardrooms, and into the subtle social pressures of modern life. Today's herd morality is more sophisticated, more pervasive, and in many ways more powerful than anything Nietzsche could have imagined. Consider social media, the ultimate conformity machine. Every platform is designed around a fundamental principle: give people what others like. The algorithm doesn't show you what's true, what's important, or what you genuinely need to see. It shows you what generates engagement, what keeps you scrolling, what makes you part of the crowd. This creates what researchers call echo chambers, but they're actually something more insidious: conformity amplifiers. You're not just hearing ideas that confirm your existing beliefs. You're being trained to believe whatever your particular tribe believes. The like button becomes a social approval mechanism. The share function becomes a loyalty test. The comment section becomes a place where dissent is buried under waves of groupthink. You've seen this happen. Someone posts an opinion that challenges the group consensus, and within minutes, they're being corrected by dozens of people who've never thought deeply about the issue, but know instinctively what the tribe believes. The dissenter doesn't just face disagreement, they face social annihilation. Most people learn quickly, conform, or be cast out. But social media is just the most visible example of a broader phenomenon. Modern corporate culture has perfected the art of manufacturing consent while maintaining the illusion of individual choice. Walk into any large corporation and you'll find mission statements about innovation, diversity of thought, and empowering employees to speak up. Then watch what actually happens when someone challenges a fundamental assumption, questions a popular initiative, or suggests that the company might be heading in the wrong direction. They'll be thanked for their input, their concerns will be noted, their feedback will be valued, and then they'll be quietly excluded from future decision-making, passed over for promotion, or gradually pushed toward the exit. The message is clear. You're free to think differently, as long as you don't actually act differently. This creates what we might call performative individuality, the appearance of independent thought within strict boundaries of acceptable opinion. You can choose your preferred coffee, your personal brand, your unique workspace setup, but you cannot question the fundamental premises of the system you're operating within. Consider how this plays out in political discourse. We're told we live in a democracy where every voice matters, where debate is healthy, where diverse viewpoints make us stronger. Yet, watch what happens to anyone who steps outside the narrow band of acceptable political opinion. They're not just disagreed with, they're demonized. They're not just wrong, they're dangerous. They're not just mistaken, they're morally defective. The system has become so polarized that genuine independent thought is nearly impossible. You must choose a tribe and adopt its entire worldview, or risk being attacked by all tribes. Even our consumer choices have become forms of herd behavior. We don't buy products anymore, we buy identities. We don't choose brands, we choose tribes. The car you drive, the coffee you drink, the clothes you wear are all signals about which group you belong to, which values you share, which team you're on. This extends into more personal domains. Dating apps reduce complex human beings to a series of signals about social status and tribal membership. Career choices are increasingly driven not by passion or aptitude, but by social prestige and peer approval. Even hobbies and interests are filtered through the lens of what others will think. The result is a society of people who look different on the surface but think remarkably alike underneath. We have endless variety in superficial choices and crushing conformity in fundamental beliefs. But here's where it gets personal. Where do you see these patterns in your own life? Think about the last time you held back an opinion because you weren't sure how it would be received. When did you last choose comfort over truth in a conversation that mattered? How often do you find yourself nodding along with things you don't really believe because it's easier than explaining your actual position? Consider your career choices. Are you doing work that genuinely excites you, or work that looks impressive to others? Are your professional goals based on your authentic interests and values, or on what success is supposed to look like in your social circle? Look at your relationships. How many of the people in your life actually know what you really think about things that matter? How often do you perform a version of yourself that's more palatable, more agreeable, more socially acceptable than who you actually are? Think about your consumption patterns. How many of the things you own or want to own are actually for your own enjoyment versus signals you're sending to others about who you are or want to be? And perhaps most importantly, when was the last time you did something that required genuine courage? When did you last take a stand that actually cost you something? When did you last choose authenticity over approval? Even when it was uncomfortable, These aren't accusations, they're invitations to honest self-examination. We all conform more than we'd like to admit. We all choose safety over authenticity more often than we care to acknowledge. We all participate in systems that we know, deep down, aren't serving our highest potential. The question isn't whether you've been shaped by herd morality. You have. We all have. The question is whether you're ready to acknowledge it, understand it, and start making different choices. Because once you see the mechanisms clearly, once you understand how they work on you specifically, you can begin the difficult but essential work of becoming an individual. But first, you have to be honest about how much of your life is actually your own. Before we dismiss conformity as purely destructive, we need to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. Herd behavior exists because it serves genuine human needs. To understand why breaking free is so difficult, we must first understand what we're actually breaking free from. There's a reason our ancestors evolved to be tribal creatures. For most of human history, the group wasn't just a source of comfort. It was literally a matter of life and death. Imagine you're living 50,000 years ago. The person who insisted on doing things their own way, who refused to follow group protocols for hunting, food sharing, or defense, wasn't a heroic individual. They were a liability. They endangered not just themselves, but everyone who depended on group coordination for survival. The tribes that survived were the ones where individuals could suppress their personal preferences for the collective good. They could share resources even when they were hungry. They could follow strategies even when they had different ideas. They could maintain social bonds even when they didn't particularly like everyone in the group. This isn't just ancient history. These dynamics still play out in crisis situations today. Consider what happens during natural disasters. The communities that recover fastest aren't necessarily the ones with the most resources or the most individual talent. They're the ones with the strongest social cohesion. They're the ones where people can quickly fall into coordinated roles, where individual egos take a back seat to collective action, where everyone trusts that everyone else will do their part. Hurricane Katrina, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, in each case, the communities that weathered the storm best were those with strong social bonds and shared values. The rugged individualists who insisted on going it alone often suffered the most. There's also something to be said for the psychological comfort that comes from shared identity and purpose. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, and it's much easier to find meaning when you're part of something larger than yourself. Think about the most fulfilling experiences of your life. How many of them involved being completely alone versus being part of a team, a family, a community working towards something together? Most people find their deepest satisfaction not in individual achievement, but in contributing to collective efforts, raising children, building organizations, serving causes they believe in. The person who completely rejects all forms of social connection and shared purpose doesn't achieve freedom. They achieve isolation. And isolated individuals are often less creative, less resilient, and less happy than those who maintain meaningful social bonds. Even the conformity pressures we've been criticizing serve important functions. Social norms exist because they solve coordination problems. When everyone follows the same basic rules about politeness, punctuality, and reciprocity, society functions more smoothly. When people can trust that others will generally behave in predictable ways, it reduces the cognitive load of every interaction. Consider something as simple as standing in line. The person who cuts to the front isn't striking a blow for individual freedom. They're being selfish at others' expense. The social pressure to wait your turn isn't oppressive conformity. It's a mechanism that allows strangers to cooperate fairly. This extends to more complex moral territories. Many of the values that Nietzsche criticized as herd morality, compassion for the weak, concern for fairness, emphasis on cooperation over competition, aren't just arbitrary social constructs. They reflect genuine insights about how human beings can live together peacefully and productively. The societies that have emphasized pure individual achievement over collective well-being haven't created paradises of authentic self-expression. They've created winner-take-all systems where most people feel alienated, anxious, and disconnected from meaningful purpose. There's also a practical argument for strategic conformity. The person who fights every battle, who refuses to compromise on anything, who insists on authenticity in every moment, doesn't usually accomplish much beyond exhausting themselves and alienating potential allies. Sometimes conforming to expectations you don't fully agree with is a form of social investment. You follow certain protocols not because you believe in them absolutely, but because doing so builds the trust and goodwill you need to be effective when it really matters. The successful entrepreneur conforms to investor expectations until they have enough power to change the system. The effective political activist works within existing institutions while building the coalition needed for reform. The artist who wants to change the culture first masters the current forms well enough to be taken seriously. Pure authenticity without strategic thinking is often just self-indulgent rebellion that accomplishes nothing beyond making the rebel feel better about themselves. And here's perhaps the strongest argument for the value of belonging. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and complete independence is neither possible nor desirable. Even Nietzsche's Übermensch wasn't meant to be a hermit. The goal wasn't to eliminate all social connection, but to choose your connections consciously rather than accepting them passively. The healthiest individuals aren't those who reject all forms of conformity. They're those who can distinguish between useful social cooperation and destructive groupthink. They can be team players when the team is moving in a direction they believe in, and they can stand alone when their core values are at stake. They understand that some battles are worth fighting and others aren't. They know the difference between compromising your tactics and compromising your soul. They recognize that building meaningful relationships sometimes requires accepting people who aren't exactly like you and accommodating preferences that aren't exactly your own. The question, then, isn't whether to conform or rebel. It's how to maintain your essential authenticity while still being able to function effectively in a social world. It's how to be genuinely yourself without becoming so isolated that you lose the ability to influence anything beyond your own private sphere. This is the real challenge, not escaping the human need for connection and belonging, but ensuring that your connections and sense of belonging serve your growth rather than stunting it. Breaking free from herd morality isn't about becoming a hermit or rejecting all forms of social connection. It's about developing the capacity to choose consciously, to distinguish between useful cooperation and destructive conformity, between authentic belonging and desperate approval seeking. This transformation happens at two levels: individual practices that build your capacity for independent thought and action, and structural changes that create environments where authenticity can flourish. Let's start with what you can do personally. The first and most crucial step is learning to be alone with your own thoughts without distraction. This isn't the same as being lonely or isolated. It's about creating regular space where you're not performing for anyone, not consuming anyone else's opinions, not reacting to external pressures. Most people are afraid of genuine solitude because it's where you confront the gap between who you are and who you've been pretending to be. It's where you realize how many of your opinions aren't really yours, how many of your desires are borrowed, how much of your identity is constructed from other people's expectations. Start small. Spend 15 minutes a day without any input. No phone, no music, no reading, no conversation. Just you and your thoughts. Notice what comes up. Notice what you try to avoid thinking about. Notice which thoughts feel genuinely yours versus which ones sound like recordings of other people's voices. As this becomes comfortable, extend the practice. Take walks without podcasts. Eat meals without entertainment. Sit in cafes without bringing anything to read. Learn to be comfortable in your own mental company. This isn't navel-gazing, it's reconnaissance. You're mapping the territory of your actual thoughts and feelings. Discovering what you believe when no one else is watching. Figuring out what you want when you're not worried about whether it's the right thing to want. Keep a daily record of moments when you conformed versus moments when you acted authentically. This isn't about judging yourself. It's about building awareness of your patterns. Write down situations where you nodded along with something you disagreed with. Note when you laughed at jokes that weren't funny to you. Record times when you stayed quiet instead of expressing your real opinion. Track purchases you made to impress others rather than please yourself. But also record the opposite. Moments when you spoke up despite social pressure, times when you made choices based on your genuine preferences, instances when you resisted the pull of the crowd. Over time, you'll start to see patterns. Certain people trigger more conformity than others. Specific environments make authenticity harder. Particular topics are more difficult to be honest about. Recognizing these patterns gives you the power to prepare for them, to make conscious choices instead of automatic reactions. You don't need to become a revolutionary overnight. Start with small but low-stakes moments where you can practice being genuine without risking everything. Order what you actually want at restaurants instead of what seems safe or impressive. Wear clothes that feel like you, rather than what's trendy. Express genuine preferences when asked for your opinion. Say, "I don't know," when you don't know, instead of pretending to have opinions you haven't formed. These might seem trivial, but they're not. Every time you choose authenticity over approval in a small moment, you're strengthening the psychological muscles you'll need for bigger moments. You're proving to yourself that you can survive social discomfort, that people won't actually reject you for being genuine, that your real preferences are worthy of expression. As you get comfortable with micro-authenticity, gradually increase the stakes. Share opinions that aren't popular in your social circle. Make choices that others might not understand. Take stands on issues that matter to you, even when it's uncomfortable. One of the most powerful tools of herd control is controlling what information people receive. If everyone is consuming the same news sources, the same social media feeds, the same cultural content, they'll naturally start thinking the same thoughts. Deliberately diversify your inputs. Read books from different decades, different cultures, different political perspectives. Seek out thinkers who challenge the assumptions of your social group. Expose yourself to ideas that make you uncomfortable, viewpoints that force you to examine your own beliefs. This doesn't mean becoming wishy-washy or losing your convictions. It means ensuring that your convictions are actually yours, that they can withstand exposure to different perspectives, that they're based on your own thinking rather than inherited assumptions. Perhaps the most difficult but necessary practice is learning to tolerate disappointing people whose approval you've been seeking. This doesn't mean becoming callous or inconsiderate. It means accepting that you can't be authentic and universally liked at the same time. Start by identifying whose approval you're most afraid of losing. What would happen if your parents, your friends, your colleagues, your romantic partner discovered that you're different than they thought you were? What's the worst-case scenario you're trying to avoid? Often you'll discover that the feared consequences are far less catastrophic than you imagine. The people who truly care about you will respect your authenticity, even if they don't always agree with your choices. The ones who reject you for being genuine weren't really accepting you anyway. They were accepting your performance. And the ones whose approval you lose by being authentic? Those relationships were built on false premises anyway. Better to discover that sooner rather than later. Individual practices are essential, but they're not sufficient. We also need to work toward creating institutions and cultural norms that reward authenticity instead of conformity. Our educational system is designed to produce compliant workers, not independent thinkers. Students are rewarded for giving the answers the teacher wants, not for asking better questions. They're taught to memorize information, not to evaluate it critically. They're encouraged to compete for grades, not to collaborate on understanding. We need educational environments that celebrate intellectual courage, that reward students for challenging assumptions, that teach critical thinking as a practical skill rather than an abstract concept. This means smaller class sizes where real discussion is possible, project-based learning that requires original thinking, and evaluation systems that measure understanding rather than memorization. Most organizations claim to want innovation while systematically punishing the behaviors that lead to innovation. They want creativity that stays within safe boundaries, disruption that doesn't actually disrupt anything important. We need to create workplaces where psychological safety is real, not just a buzzword, where people can express dissenting views without career consequences, where mistakes are treated as learning opportunities rather than failures, where success is measured by contribution rather than compliance. This requires leadership that models intellectual humility, decision-making processes that actively seek out dissenting views, and promotion criteria that reward independent thinking alongside team collaboration. Our cultural stories shape our sense of what's possible and what's valuable. Right now, most of our narratives celebrate either rugged individualism that ignores social connection or conformist belonging that ignores individual authenticity. We need stories that show what healthy independence looks like. People who can think for themselves while still caring about others. Who can stand up for their values while remaining open to growth. Who can resist social pressure without becoming antisocial. This means supporting artists, writers, and creators who explore the complexity of authentic living, who show characters struggling with real moral dilemmas rather than simplified good versus evil conflicts, who demonstrate that courage and compassion can coexist. The path forward isn't about choosing between individual freedom and social connection. It's about creating a culture where authentic individuals can form genuine communities, where people can be themselves while still contributing to something larger than themselves. This is possible. It requires work, both inner and outer. But it's the only path that leads to lives worth living. So, here you are, at the end of this exploration, and nothing has changed. You still have the same job, the same relationships, the same daily routines. You still live in the same world where conformity is rewarded and authenticity is risky. The herd is still there, waiting for you to return to its comfortable embrace. But now you know something you didn't know before. You understand the mechanisms that keep you small. You recognize the ways you've been trading your authentic self for social approval. You see how the system operates and how it makes mediocrity feel like wisdom. The question is, what will you do with this knowledge? You have 3 choices, and you're making one of them right now. The first choice is to forget what you've learned, to close this mental door and go back to the comfortable unconsciousness of herd living, to tell yourself that authenticity is a luxury you can't afford, that conformity is just being practical. This is the choice most people make. They'll nod along with insights about courage and individuality, but they won't actually change anything. If you make this choice, you won't be punished for it. The herd rewards forgetting. The second choice is to rebel without purpose, to reject conformity simply because it's conformity, to mistake contrarianism for authenticity. But this isn't freedom. It's just another form of bondage. You're still letting the crowd determine your choices, just in reverse. The third choice is the hardest. To begin the slow, uncertain work of becoming who you actually are. This means accepting that you might not even know who you really are yet, after years of conforming to others' expectations. It means being willing to disappoint people whose approval you've spent your life seeking. It means starting small and gradually building the courage to live authentically in the areas that matter most. This path offers no guarantees. You might lose some relationships. You might face professional consequences. You might discover that some of your dreams were borrowed from others. But here's what it does offer: the possibility of a life that's actually yours. Not a life that looks impressive to others, but a life that feels meaningful to you. Not a life free from all difficulty, but a life where the difficulties are chosen rather than imposed. Not a life of perfect independence, but a life of conscious choice. Nietzsche believed that most people never make this choice. They live their entire lives as herd animals, never discovering what they might have become if they'd had the courage to find out who they actually were. But he also believed that the choice was always available, that anyone, at any moment, could decide to step out of the comfortable prison of conformity and into the terrifying freedom of authentic selfhood. The question he poses is deceptively simple. Will you remain a member of the herd, or will you dare to become an individual? You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to become a revolutionary. You just need to take the next small step toward being genuine instead of performing, toward choosing instead of conforming, toward becoming instead of just existing. The herd will still be there if you change your mind. It always is. But this moment, this particular intersection of awareness and possibility, might not come again. Where in your own life have you noticed yourself blending into the herd instead of speaking with your own voice? What would change if you decided, starting today, that your authentic self was worth the risk of other people's disapproval? The choice, as always, is yours.